everyone, and welcome to our Litigation and Legislation for Animal Rights seminar series, with today's seminar being on strategic litigation for chickens and hens. We will have a 1 hour discussion with Edie Bowles, a solicitor and the managing director of the UK law firm Advocates for Animals, and the founder and executive director of the Animal Law Foundation, and Catherine Evans, a staff attorney at Legal Impact for Chickens, a litigation nonprofit organization in the United States that is dedicated to making sure animal cruelty laws are being enforced in industrial animal agriculture. I would like to remind everyone that today's discussion will be recorded, and the recording will then be uploaded to ICARE's YouTube channel. Edie and Catherine, we are absolutely delighted to have both of you joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So I'd like to start off by inviting both of you to introduce yourselves and share your thoughts on why chickens and egg-laying hens are one of the most systematically exploited animals, and yet they remain severely underprotected. So I know this is a loaded question, but in very broad terms, would you be able to paint the picture of how our existing legal frameworks fail to protect chickens and egg-laying hens?
Sure, I can start. I'm Catherine. I work at a US-based organization called Legal Impact for Chickens. I've been with them for about a year and a half. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and so yeah, most of my knowledge is going to be US-based. So chickens are raised and slaughtered in the highest number of any land animal that's used for human consumption. About 95% of the land animals killed for human consumption in the US are chickens raised for meat. If you add in egg-laying hens, ducks, turkeys, other birds, it's 98% of land animals slaughtered in the US. And the US government essentially only regulates how farmed animals are treated at slaughter. And for birds, the protections are pretty minimal. It's basically you can't handle birds in a way that causes excessive bruising, and you have to kill the bird by, a knife cut to the throat. They can't die by other means. Aside from that, there's some guidance on reducing salmonella on the farms, and the USDA certifies organic farms, which is a pretty small number of farms. And other than that, chickens and other birds are just protected by state laws. So some states have laws that say you can't have egg-laying hens in cages. Other than that, it's basically just the animal cruelty laws that say you can't cause unnecessary harm to animals, and those have a wide range of exemptions. So sometimes farmed animals are exempt and sometimes they are not, and we might get into that more later, but that's kind of the broad strokes of protections for chickens in the US.
Thanks, Catherine. There's some similarities with the UK and some differences. So the similarities are that they're also the most farmed animal in the UK, and the similarity is that they're also treated appallingly during farming. However, where there's a key difference is that chickens probably don't have less welfare protection than any other farmed animal in the UK. They are protected during farming. They have all the same kind of foundational legal protections as any other animal. As any other farmed animal, or at least comparable. So I think in the UK context, the issue is probably more that you can farm an animal in these atrocious conditions. You can farm an animal in a huge shed with tens of thousands of other animals closely packed together. And then another reason why I think it happens is because they tend to be farmed inside and therefore outside of kind of public view. And as a result of that, there's a huge issue with the oversight and the application of the laws. So whilst they do have some legal protections and a comparable amount of legal protections to other farmed animals, the way that kind of manifests is different. Although I don't want to kind of overstate how other farmed animals are treated, because actually there's a similar oversight problem and a similar enforcement problem there as well. But yeah, I think it's probably largely to do with the fact that you can farm them in such huge numbers and in such cramped conditions as to why we see them being treated the way that they are.
Well, thank you both for that description. I think that touches on the gravity and extent of the issue. I think it's worth pausing here and before we dive deeper into these welfare issues, um, I think it would be worth considering what interests and needs of these birds are being denied. So I'd love to hear your perspectives on what we know about chickens and hens and how their chickenhood or henhood, so to speak, is compromised in these oppressive settings. So would one or both of you like to elaborate on this point?
Sure. So chickens are really social animals. We know they can recognize around 100 faces. That includes humans and other chickens. When they're kept in flocks of 100 or fewer, they maintain pecking orders and they have a really organized social structure. But when they're in huge barns with thousands of other chickens, that isn't really possible for them. We know humans have figured out at least 24 distinct vocal sounds that they make that they use to communicate different things to each other. If a chicken sees a predator, they will make a certain sound that warns other chickens that there's a predator around. Mother hens and baby chicks, even before the chick hatches, they will be talking to each other like through the egg, which is really cool. Chickens have been documented bringing food to blind companions and helping them navigate around, like they know that the other bird can't see where they're going. Chicks less than a week old can count and do some like really basic math. Um, in nature, chickens will be hunting around for bugs and plants to eat. They like to dust bathe. They roost in trees. They like to be up high so that they can see more. They feel a little more safe. But of course, in factory farms, especially chickens raised for meat, they're typically just kept indoors in really giant barns with really dirty floors. And they don't typically have raised surfaces for roosting, so they can't really do any of these natural behaviors.
I mean, it's a really great description, Catherine. Thank you so much for sharing that information with us. So I guess on that note, I would like to sort of transition and ask about the legality of breeding practices in these farming industries. Edie, would you be able to tell us more about your work on legally advocating for chickens, particularly with respect to the case of the Frankenchickens? What are Frankenchickens and the legality or illegality surrounding them?
Yeah, great question. So Frankenchickens are fast-growing chickens, chickens that have been selectively bred to reach slaughter weight, which is around 2.2 kilograms within 5 to 6 weeks. And as a result of this fast growth, that's exponentially, that's so extremely fast. And as a result of this fast growth, they suffer from a range of health and welfare issues from organ failure, broken legs, as a result of broken legs sitting within their own kind of waste and getting burns over their body. So it's a really, it's a really detrimental breeding practice. The case that I've been involved in up until very recently, although it's ongoing in the background, was a challenge against the government over essentially the keeping of these animals, arguing that it's unlawful to keep them. There is no specific legal provision that says that a Frankenchicken, a fast-growing chicken, is illegal. However, there is a legal provision that says you can't keep an animal for farming purposes if on the basis of their genetics, they're prone to detriment to their health or welfare. Now, our client, so this is with my Advocates for Animals, the law firm hat on, so my client, the Humane League, argued essentially that of course this applies to fast-grown chickens. If not fast-grown chickens, an animal whose genes are causing them to suffer a detriment to their health and welfare, if it doesn't apply to chickens, then what animal does it apply to? The case was a kind of a mixed bag in terms of the results. So we were unsuccessful arguing against the government for the keeping of these animals, largely on a technicality, because the government don't have a statement that says one way or another whether these breeds are legal or not. So as a result of that, the type of case that we brought, which is called a judicial review, it meant that there wasn't a hook really for the court to say, the government's behaved unlawfully. However, the court did provide a legal interpretation for what this provision means, what this provision that I just said about keeping animals prone to detriment for their health and welfare. And it's our client's position that this would render fast-growing chickens illegal. We would, however, if we want to, be successful in that, we would have to go to the criminal courts and argue against an individual keeper of these birds. However, we are in a stronger position than we were before the case in terms of proving that these birds are in fact illegal.
And Edie, I mean, this judgment has been described as having potential to have a seismic impact for billions of animals. Would you care to share your views on these sorts of statements? Do you think that this could extend to other animals, this basic logic?
Absolutely. I mean, the provision that I'm referring to is in the welfare of farmed animals regulations. So it applies to any, farmed animal kept for various things, food, wool, and I think other products is the definition. So yes, I mean, if another animal is being kept that has genes that mean that they're kind of prone to detriment, then absolutely this provision could apply. So yes, in that way, I think that statements like that are fair. Yeah, it's one of those things that we need to get it over the line. There's still work to be done. But absolutely, we do have a provision that is favourable to protect animals from this problematic breeding. And what we need to see, unfortunately, there may also be a scenario where you could challenge the government. So, for example, if the government did say something about the keeping of another animal that had been bred in such a way that their genes meant that they're prone to detriment, then potentially you could challenge the government for that position. Otherwise, it really is in the hands of the criminal courts, which is a whole lengthy process, and there's obviously certain evidential requirements. But I think it could have absolutely huge consequences. And as things currently stand, there is a really favourable provision that we need to start utilising.
So just building on this idea that their genes, as a result of selective intensive breeding practices in this farming setting, causes them immense suffering and is perhaps even or should be regarded as illegal, intuitively makes sense. But what does this mean concretely for these chickens and hens? Would it require actively preventing their reproduction to avoid perpetuating this cycle of suffering by not breeding at all in the first place?
So legally speaking, the provision is actually it prohibits the keeping. But of course, the consequence of that. So technically, you could still breed these animals, and I guess maybe keep them as I don't want to give any ideas to people, to be honest. But there are scenarios where you could breed the animal, I suppose. But the fact that you can't keep them means that obviously they have no commercial value. That I'm speaking in the kind of context of if we were successful in the criminal courts. So yes, I think the knock-on effect of that would be that you would there'd be no value, commercial value in breeding these animals.
And Eddie, would you be able to share with us, or sorry, Edie, would you be able to share with us the key takeaways from the Frankenchicken case in terms of legal advocacy, what we can learn from these cases?
Absolutely. And I think that the case was a real masterclass in legal advocacy. I'm being credit to my client, the Humane League, in this regard. And of course I also run the Animal Law Foundation, and it will also kind of benefit from a similar situation in the future. But I think that the law is a really great vehicle to be able to talk about animal protection. It's incredibly, it's people want the laws that exist to protect animals to mean something in practice. People are reassured that these laws exist in the first place. So where they're not being applied, or where these awful practices are taking place, when people reassure themselves that they can't happen because, the UK has some of the best welfare standards, I think people are shocked that that this is happening. So I think that legal advocacy is a very unique vehicle in that regard. I think you get a lot of buy-in from the outset. And then I think, it's exciting. It's exciting to take the government to court. and it's very newsworthy. And so there's these real benefits of, of a legal challenge for campaigning and for advocacy purposes that I really think my client, the Humane League, maximized and got the message across. Now, of course, it's all through a very, very legitimate, credible case. It was completely arguable throughout. I mean, evidently so, because we do have a largely favorable judgment. So none of that had to be kind of compromised in the process. But, the Humane League was also able to package that up and communicate it to the public and really change, actually. I think the case was instrumental in public awareness over these birds. And if that doesn't kind of indicate how impactful legal advocacy can be, then I'm not sure what would. So yes, legal advocacy is definitely worthwhile.
So, Edie, you mentioned the Animal Law Foundation. Would you be able to elaborate on the legal basis for the Animal Law Foundation's challenge against the government's code of practice that permit the handling of chickens by their legs? How does this practice conflict with existing UK legislation?
Yes, so just for those of you on the call who don't know, I run two organisations, Advocates for Animals, which is a law firm, and through Advocates for Animals, we represent clients. So you just heard of the Frankenchickens case, I was representing the Humane League. The Animal Law Foundation is a legal charity where we will research law and how it's being applied and potentially bring our own cases. The first of which, we've only been going for a couple of years now, the first of which is a challenge against the government, a judicial review, challenging their codes of practice. So there's an EU-derived law that says you can't pick animals up by the legs during transport operations. Now, the only time you'd ever handle a chicken, save for a few exceptions, would be during transport operations. They're taken from the hatcheries, they're dumped in these sheds, and the next time they get picked up is to take them to slaughter, so to transport them to slaughter. Now, the standard practice of handling these chickens during that process is scooping them up by the legs and shoving them in crates. Now, this EU protection does not carve out chickens. Chickens are also protected from this practice, this handling practice. However, the government's code of practice says that chickens must be handled by two legs, not one. So we argue that that's an unlawful statement because, in fact, under the law, they can't be handled by any legs. The reason why this is really important from an animal welfare perspective is because not only is the whole practice very traumatic just in terms of the speed of it and the shoving in the crates, but also chickens really suffer when they're held upside down. They don't have a diaphragm, so they struggle to breathe. There's leg breakages involved. So it's a really awful experience, an awful moment in their already short lives, very, very stressful, very painful. And so it's absolutely a huge welfare issue. And on top of that, it's illegal. So we're challenging the government over these codes of practice.
So, Edie, you mentioned lifting both the legs versus one of the legs. Is that part of the government's proposal to amend the law permitting the leg catching practices, or is it something else when it comes to sort of like a post-Brexit commitment to enhance animal welfare standards?
Yeah, great question. So what makes this case particularly complicated is, so, as mentioned, it was already standard practice to, illegal, but standard practice to pick these chickens up by the legs. But when confronted with this legal challenge, rather than the government enforce the law and look at ways to improve the law, they have opened and recently closed a consultation where they've made it clear that their preference is to remove this protection, this legal protection. So essentially start the process of them diluting the law. They've said that their preference is to essentially cement in law picking them up by two legs, not one. But however, they say that that's what's currently required. So I don't see that as being any improvement than what they already say is required in their codes of practice. I think that that's largely just maybe spin from them. But yes, essentially they are in the process of trying to dilute the law to allow for the handling of chickens by legs, albeit by two legs and not one. The Brexit stuff that you referred to is slightly different because this is actually a dilution. This isn't an improvement. The Brexit stuff is more, although it was a Conservative government and we've now got a Labour government, but during Brexit, lots of promises were made that animal welfare, as a result of leaving the EU, we'd now be able to improve our animal welfare standards. We wouldn't be tied to the European Union. And lots of promises were made to this effect. And yet, and of course the government, the then shadow government, the now Labour government, also echoed this sentiment, because of course they know that it's incredibly popular with the public. They also echoed the sentiment of improving animal welfare. And yet, when in power, this is their first animal welfare policy to dilute the law, to try to start this process of diluting the law. Now, from our perspective, we're in a better position from where we were, because, of course, nothing has changed on the ground for chickens. Yet what we've been able to do through this case is we've been able to kind of shine a light on what the standard practice is, and of course force the government to admit that they don't want to enforce this law, that instead they'd rather dilute it. But it's not over yet. We're working, we've still got this active case challenging their codes of practice. And on top of that, we are talking to MPs to make sure that, should they be successful in trying, in with their consultation and trying to dilute this law, that MPs are aware of it when it reaches Parliament, and that they can make their objections known. So we're not, it's not all doom and gloom yet. It's just looking very, very worrying.
So Edie, the last question I'm going to ask you for now, what role do you see the public engagement and advocacy when it comes to influencing policy decisions related to animal welfare, especially as we mentioned in this context of post-Brexit legislative changes? How can legal professionals, animal welfare organizations, and the public generally collaborate to ensure that animal welfare laws are not only being maintained, but also effectively enforced?
Yeah, what a great question. Yeah, I think that there is huge scope to be had with individuals, with activists, with NGOs, to ensure that laws are there, and that the laws that are there are interpreted favorably and enforced. Now, the organizations that I'm involved in, are mostly involved in the second two, the making sure that they're interpreted favorably and enforced. However, even with those two, just taking those two and not talking about actually passing the laws, I think there's huge potential to be unlocked. I think without lawyers looking over these laws that exist, the laws are left to the government and to industry to interpret them. And I think that actually a lot of practices that we see are as a result of there not being lawyers looking over these laws. I think that law that derived from the EU, the one that lots of our laws derive from the EU, but the one to do with the Frankenchickens, the keeping animals, the prohibition on keeping animals prone to detriment, which also derived from the EU. I think that had there been more animal lawyers around at the time when that law was passed, I think a lot of practices could have been nipped in the bud by lawyers saying, hang on a second, don't we have this provision? But instead, what we saw was a provision that I think pretty much got forgotten. And then, fast forward a couple of decades, and then you have a case like the Frankenchicken case, which is using this law. So yeah, I think that we should all be making, all spending time looking at the legislation that already exists, looking over the new legislation that's being proposed, making sure that for those of you that are involved in, in lobbying for new laws, making sure that law, getting rid of loopholes. We see that to move away from the chickens, which is obviously the topic of today, but fox hunting is a really contentious issue in England and the UK. And one of the things that's the the Hunting Act is known for is it being rife with loopholes. And if there were lawyers, and of course there would have been lawyers at the time as well, but if possible, it would have been good for lawyers to be able to spot those loopholes at the time and to shut them down. And then once the law is passed, just making sure that we're all kind of very aware of any ongoing or developing industry practices and how they might be incompatible with the legislation in place, and nipping that stuff in the bud there and then.
Thank you, Edie. So now, Catherine, I have some questions for you. Legal impact for chickens has gained a lot of attention for taking an unconventional path to protect farm chickens, especially broiler chickens, through corporate and shareholder litigation. Could you explain this strategy to our audience, and how are you using corporate law to hold companies accountable for cruelty to chickens?
Yeah, so when you buy stock in a publicly traded company, you are buying a part ownership in that company. And so for US-based companies, any stockholder has the right as an owner in the corporation to make sure that management of the corporation is basically running the corporation well. And so one of the things that the board of directors and the very high management of corporations has to do is make sure that the company is following laws. And US shareholders can do things like make a formal demand to a board of directors or request records from company leadership if they have evidence to believe that the company is violating laws. You can make a proposal that all the shareholders vote on. And if a shareholder has evidence that the board of directors is causing or permitting the company to violate laws. So that can include if there are red flags that legal violations are happening within the corporation and the board is not adequately preventing those. The shareholder can sue on behalf of the company to make the leadership actually follow the laws. And so that's called a shareholder derivative lawsuit. Legal Impact for Chickens brought our first shareholder derivative lawsuit a few years ago. So basically, another organization called Animal Outlook did an investigation into a Costco subsidiary chicken farm. They were using Frankenchickens that Edie was talking about. So a lot of the birds were dying very slow and painful deaths because they grew so big they couldn't walk, or they had other issues that prevented them from moving, so they couldn't access food and water, and they were not being humanely euthanized. They were just being left to die. When this investigation came out, Costco's leadership actually responded to the investigation and said, this is normal activity on farms, like nothing to see here. And so that was evidence that leadership knew this was happening. They weren't going to change anything about the practices, and they were just going to continue to let these chickens die this way. And the states where Costco operates has laws that say you have to provide your animals with adequate food and water. So Legal Impact for Chickens represented two Costco shareholders who said you are violating these state laws by not providing all of your chickens with adequate food and water, and the board is clearly not going to do anything to fix these violations. So that suit did get some news. Unfortunately, the judge in that suit did not believe that the corporation was violating laws, basically because the investigation was made public and there were no prosecutions against the company. So then the shareholders requested that the board investigate the cruelty that was happening, and the board did do an investigation into that.
So, what are some of the advantages using this shareholders litigation in the context of chicken and factory farming chickens? What are the limitations? Are there risks that the animal suffering is getting framed too narrowly in corporate terms? If you could just, go into those details, that'd be great.
Yeah, so animal law is always a tough area of law because animals themselves don't have standing. They can't bring a lawsuit on their own behalf. And so animal law cases are often framed in terms of how humans are injured by abuse to animals. And Legal Impact for Chickens is always looking for ways to, center what's actually happening to animals. Shareholder litigation is really just another tool to try to make companies follow the law. One thing that's good about it is that it is really focusing on the company and the leadership and the systems that are in place that are allowing these abuses to happen instead of focusing on like one farm or particular workers who are kind of caught up in this system and really forced within the system that if they want to keep their jobs, they have to sort of perpetuate the abuses. So we're really trying to hold leadership accountable. There's the obvious limit that you have to have a shareholder in the company who wants to take up a public fight with the company and try to change things. There are some other tools that Legal Impact for Chickens uses where our organization can be a plaintiff and file a lawsuit on behalf of animals, and shareholder litigation is different, where you have to have a shareholder. And there has to be a law that actually prohibits the abuse that is taking place there. So that's where our whole patchwork of state laws with their different exemptions kind of comes in.
That's great, Catherine. Thank you so much. Would you be able to, I know you sort of mentioned it, but would you be able to go into more detail about one of your landmark cases, which is the shareholders derivative lawsuit filed against Costco's executive, obviously over the treatment of boiler chickens, also known as the Frankenchicken case. Could you go into a little bit more detail on that case?
Yeah, so I was unfortunately not at like when that case was litigated, and that's like the basic overview. I can talk a little bit more, I guess, about fiduciary duties. So the board of directors and the very high management of corporations all have fiduciary duties to the company. And one of those is the duty of care. So that's basically watching out for red flags that legal violations are happening in your corporation and comporting yourself in a way that you make sure there are controls in place, that your company is being profitable, but also following the law. In the US, most company, when you start a company, you have to file articles of incorporation, and you have to say the purpose of the company. And most companies these days just say any lawful purpose. So if they're violating the law, they're doing something that's against their purpose. And obviously there are a lot of consequences that can happen if your company is violating the law. So our legal argument is really premised on a breach of fiduciary duty. We have to show that the board of directors or other managers are violating their duty of care. They're not acting in a careful way to make sure that the company is following the laws. And then you also have to prove the underlying legal violation of what's happening on the farms to the animals and how that violates state laws.
Thank you, Catherine. So, with that case specifically, we know it was dismissed and it received a lot of attention. And some commentators said that it laid the foundation for a new type of animal law strategy. Although you didn't work on that case specifically, would you be able to comment on the impact you think that this case had for the legal field, for chickens, or for corporate accountability more broadly?
Yeah, I would say for chickens, definitely the news cover. There was a big, I believe, New York Times article about the case. We heard a lot of anecdotes about people, learning how. So Costco has its own subsidiary farms, has its own subsidiary with these farms to grow rotisserie chickens that they sell for, I believe, $4.99. And it's specifically a whole chicken for $5 is very cheap, and they lose money on this product, but it's something that brings in customers. People buy memberships because they love the rotisserie chicken. And so that's partially why the conditions on the farms are so bad, is because they're trying to keep the product so cheap. And so getting news out there that the products were so cheap because the chickens were being treated so poorly. There was like one person who ran a Facebook page specifically for fans of Costco who like shut down her Facebook page because she found out how bad the conditions were for the chickens. So that was great. And then definitely just getting the word out there that if you're a shareholder, you have some power to push the companies that you own to be better, and getting lawyers to think about like different mechanisms that we can use for animals, where most of the protection on farms are straight state cruelty laws that would typically just be enforced by prosecutors.
Great. So, Catherine, do you think that this legal strategy that you talked about would work in other jurisdictions, or is it uniquely suited to the US corporate legal framework? And could you imagine similar arguments being made in other jurisdictions, even outside the EU or the US, if cruelty to chickens was framed as a reputational or legal risk to these corporations?
Yeah, so I really only know about US law. I will say US corporations, a lot of our meat companies are operating internationally, and so it's possible that um, if you live somewhere else, you could maybe do something with a US corporation. But I would say if you like look up shareholder derivative laws or lawsuits if you live in other areas of the world and see if that's a possibility.
Thank you, Catherine. So, would you be able to tell us a bit more about legal impact for chickens and other perhaps legal strategies that are being employed to challenge industrial farming practices and enforce cruelty laws? When I was looking at your website, I saw that it states that prosecutors rarely enforce cruelty laws against powerful corporations behind animal agriculture. And so it allows companies to commit these egregious violations despite there being legal protections, and that strategic civil litigation offers sort of a path forward. Would you be able to speak on both of those points?
Yeah. So as I said at the beginning, the US federal government really only regulates slaughterhouses as far as farmed animal welfare. And then the whole rest of a chicken or any other animal's life is on the farm is basically only protected by these state animal cruelty laws. And states don't have inspection programs where they're going out onto farms and seeing, how animals are being treated. So abuses on farms are generally only uncovered if a whistleblower speaks up, an employee, or if an undercover investigator goes in and gets evidence about how the animals are being treated. And then a lot of prosecutors in states, they might not know that state cruelty laws cover animals who are in agriculture. Some of them think that it's only for like companion animals. Um, and a lot of prosecutors we have learned are not familiar with how to prosecute a corporation as opposed to an individual. So LIC was really founded to kind of fill in the gaps there, to help, educate prosecutors, but also find different ways that we as a nonprofit can make sure that the laws are enforced. So there are some states that allow humane societies or other organizations to sue to enforce animal cruelty laws. There are some states that allow any citizen to report animal cruelty to a magistrate judge, and then you could maybe get a search warrant to get more evidence of the cruelty. Sometimes you can get a special prosecutor appointed to address the animal cruelty. And then there are some methods that are totally outside of the criminal law. So one thing that's kind of popular in the US is a false advertising lawsuit. So if a company is selling an animal-based product with labeling claims about how the animals are treated, and then we have evidence that the animals are not actually being treated that way, you can sometimes sue the company to at least try to get that advertising claim removed and maybe get some more consumer awareness about how their products are being produced.
That makes sense. Would you be able to sort of highlight a concrete case or lawsuit that illustrates these legal strategies being employed just to animate that conversation?
Yeah, so on the false advertising front, we had a case against a butcher shop in DC that was selling foie gras as humanely raised. And if you all know, foie gras is produced by force feeding ducks, and it's very much not humane. And so we sued them for false advertising, and they um, responded to our lawsuit by saying we stopped selling foie gras. So that was exciting. On the Humane Society front, so Legal Impact for Chickens was incorporated as a society for the prevention of cruelty to animals, so an SPCA in California. And so we there is a law in California that says that SPCAs can file complaints to enforce any law relating to animals in California. So we have a case that's ongoing right now against actually a dairy farm. So we don't just do chickens, but there was a dairy company in California that operates as organic and regenerative. They have all of these great advertising claims, but another group, Farm Forward, found a lot of abuses happening on their various farms. A lot of whistleblowers spoke up about the cows being treated really poorly. And so we have a case that recently a judge ruled that our case is allowed to proceed into discovery. So we'll be able to get some more information from the farm about how the cows are being treated. And then we have another case in North Carolina that is about chickens. And North Carolina has an animal cruelty law that says any citizen or any person can sue to enforce their animal cruelty law, and person is defined to include organizations. So Legal Impact for Chickens is also the plaintiff in that case. That case is based on an Animal Outlook undercover investigation in a hatchery where there were a lot of abuses happening to chickens. So in both the California case and the North Carolina case, we are just suing to get a court order that says the companies cannot continue to do these illegal practices.
So I'm just going to follow up because you mentioned this role of whistleblowers, and sort of in a day and age where there's more and more ag-gag laws and protections against people coming into farms and recording the evidence that then is critical for these cases. How do you see that in conjunction with being able to gather this evidence on one hand, but also there being such barriers that are increasing for whistleblowers?
Yeah, I would say the biggest barrier for whistleblowers is that if they want to keep their job and be able to be employed in agriculture in the future, they don't want to be publicly known as someone who goes and reports their company for legal violations and gets the company in trouble. And so we see a lot of people who are just afraid to speak up or who want to report to us, but they want to remain anonymous. And unfortunately, in the US legal system, it's very hard to keep your sources of information anonymous because the defendant has rights to know where your information is coming from and to also like question those people. As far as ag-gag laws, there are a few that still remain in the US. So these say like it's illegal to film on a farm or to, otherwise collect information from farms without the owner's permission. A lot of them have been struck down as unconstitutional because we have free speech rights that protect things like making videos and speaking about what you see on farms. So it's definitely a thing that we keep an eye on, but luckily they're not in a ton of states, and a lot of them have been found invalid in court.
Wonderful, thank you. So I guess I would love to just end our discussion by saying that both of you represent wonderful organizations, both Legal Impact for Chickens and Advocates for Animals and the Animal Law Foundation are doing groundbreaking work in legally protecting chickens and egg-laying hens. And I think it would just be great to end this discussion by inviting both of you to comment on the broader implications for advocacy and reform, or ask each other questions, or comment on any of the points that were raised over the course of this discussion. So I'm just opening up the floor to you both. Any final thoughts that you'd like to share with each other or ask each other?
Sure, absolutely. So Catherine, I really love the fact that you're doing these shareholder actions. Is there anything, it's something that we've loosely kind of thought about. It's not something that's going to happen in the anytime soon, but it's absolutely something we would like to explore and have another tool available. Is there anything you think we should be aware of going in? Any risks that can we learn from anything that you've been through throughout that process?
Yeah, I'm not sure about UK laws, I would say in the US, one thing that's very important, you have to request records from a corporation before you can sue them. Basically, our laws really protect, like, the board of directors is supposed to have control over the company. And so when a shareholder is coming in and trying to kind of overtake what the board does, you have to go through a lot of steps. So you have to first get records from the board, and then you also have to prove that the board of directors basically cannot be trusted to fix the issue on their own.
Mhm.
So there are just a lot of elements of the lawsuit that you have to think about before even getting to the substance of, like, what's happening to the animals.
That's so interesting. And so just a quick follow-up. Do you have to say why you're requesting those documents, or are you able to keep some cards close to your chest?
No, you have to, in the books and records request, you have to prove that you have by a preponderance of the evidence, it's like evidence to prove that there was potential mismanagement or illegal conduct happening. And so there are a lot of actual lawsuits where a shareholder will make a books and records request, the company refuses to produce records, and then you sue over whether or not you actually have a basis to suspect that the board is mismanaging the company, and then a judge will say whether they have to produce the records.
Fascinating. Thank you.
And Catherine, do you have any questions for Edie?
I don't.
Oh, that's okay. So thank you both for this wonderful discussion. It was so informative, and the way you presented all the information was just amazing. So yes, if everyone can just join me in some virtual claps to our speakers today. Thank you so much for our speakers and everyone in attendance.